Hi, I'm Tuhin. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Baseten. We're speaking with Corinne Riley here, who's a partner at Greylock. What surprised you about the inference space over the last 12 months?
Yeah. I think people are really starting to recognize what you've been saying for a long time, which is just the complexity it's quite deep in inference, right? And I think customers that are starting out small, they might think, hey, this is pretty easy. This is a commodity. It's not going to be that hard. And then, you get to a certain level of scale and there's real complexity behind it. And so I think the thing that's surprised me on the upside is there's a lot of very significant like developer workflows that Base 10 has built and really can continue to build that are giving developers like the more granular controls that they want over their stack. And I think that complexity, we're going to see that continue to drive death, right? And I think if you look back a couple of years ago, you might not have predicted where customers would want to own their control. And so that's really worked in Base 10's favor.
Yeah, and kind of maybe talking about that a bit. Um, I think there's kind of like three different parts of this problem. One is, where does like I need to do inference. The second one is like, yeah, I need to do inference with custom models. And three is like, I have a lot of models.
Yeah.
I need a ton of workflow.
Yeah.
That sounds like you're really teasing at that third part a bit, which is, hey, the first to go without saying, but really as you start to build the CI/CD and all those things into the workflows, there's a ton of complexity.
Yeah, and I'm sure, I mean, you've worked with customers that I think you talked with customers that are extremely, extremely opinionated and very smart in the space. I know you have customers that are AI researchers themselves, right? If they wanted to go build this themselves, maybe they could, and maybe they think they can. But I feel like you've given me many examples where, they kind of see what's possible with Base 10 and they realize there's no reason they should be doing it themselves, right? And if they, it's better off for them and their company to offload that complexity to you.
Yeah, and maybe just focus a bit more on what's differentiated
Yeah.
for the companies. Awesome. And then kind of like that's kind of going from what we've seen in last year to what's coming up over the next year. At a high level in the market, what are you excited about? This is kind of your job.
Yeah. It is kind of my job. I mean, I'll turn it over to you to talk about the product side of things, but I would say at the larger, like super high level go to market side of things, we've seen these AI native companies grow extremely quickly, right? And I think for the first time in many years, you're seeing some companies, new companies get to pretty significant scale in a very short amount of time. And that obviously is immediately beneficial to Base 10. I think the next couple of years is going to be about the even larger slew of companies that are incumbents, right? Who some of them have started using AI, right? And some of them do have it in production with their customers, but start seeing that to get to a more real and larger scale. That's really the next kind of big wave that we're cresting up on that I think is going to be massive for Base 10. And but in terms of the product and I think there's obviously many directions that Base 10 can go. So I'm going to turn it over to you and say like, what do you want to? What are you excited about?
Yeah, I think obviously over the last a couple months we've seen this pretty big gap close between open source and closed source models, and that like in the reality is that gives enterprises and even beyond enterprises, large people with significant user bases, options beyond the foundation model companies in terms of how they use their models. And I think with that comes even a lot more complexity in terms of how you run them. And so I'm really excited to enable a bunch of those use cases to come along with those models. And like we think that over the next 6 to 9 months and through 2025, this is going to be an acceleration of models being released that are usable and using them inside your own VPC and using them with some customization and fine tuning will become more and more important.
Yeah.
Awesome. And then kind of stepping back, you invest in a lot of AI native startups aiming to go from C to the A to B and beyond. What should founders consider when they're scaling up themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, and this gets into a variety of topics, right? And we can go into all of them, but obviously there's from the tech stack perspective, like all of these questions around build versus buy, right? From the go to market perspective, there's I think this has been a plague of AI to some degree, where there's been a lot of, let's call it just demoing that is demoing ahead of the product. And I think, I'm a big believer in that can work. But there's also been, I think, some significant examples of customer relationships getting burnt and people starting to be distrustful of it. And then the last one, the last kind of question, right, or category that I put this in is, there's a significant amount of AI tourism, right, where consumers and customers are willing to try a lot of different things. And so being able to tease out what's actual product market fit, and particularly after your seed or Series A as you're growing, and making sure that those metrics you're seeing are actually reliable for many rounds to come. That's the other big question I think a lot of these companies are dealing with later than they might have historically, right?
Yeah. And like by that you mean like just because these companies grow so fast, so quickly, a company with tens of $1 millions of revenue 3 years ago looked very different to what it might look today.
I think so, right? Because there's just such a massive appetite to try new things.
Yeah.
Right. And so teasing apart, am I seeing this growth because this is durable growth and there's real product market fit? Or am I seeing this growth because, hey, I'm in a market that has a lot of customer traction and pull. And so people are willing to try all these different things. I'm getting the benefit of that. But I need to tease apart what's the real product that's going to get me not just to 10, but to 50, 100 million.
Just kind of going back to those companies scaling, what are early signs or product market fit for AI founders that they should, really be paying attention to? Because you're kind of saying it's like, hey, there's always questions around durability of this and, what's real and what's the market.
This is a small framework that we use, but I would say there's a couple of questions that if we believe that if you can answer these questions reliably, and not only you as a founder, but then if you hire someone to go do sales for you, right? If you can answer these questions reliably, you probably have a initial phases of product market fit. And those questions are, right, do you consistently know who the buyer is going to be and right where in the org they're sitting and exactly like what their needs are? The second question is, what do you need to show that person to convince them to start a POV, right? Assuming you're in a POV motion. And the third question is, assuming you get that POV, what technical win do you need to win to get that customer? And by the way, that includes what you need to do as it relates to your competition as well. And then the last question is, right, like, do you consistently know what the value / budget for that tool would be, right? And those things seem so simple, but I actually think many people don't have clear answers to that, right? Or there's continuous exceptions, there's continuous but this, that, or the other. And actually, right, if I think about the Baseten journey and I think about the last couple of years, I think you guys have honed in on each of those, like, at this point, many years ago, right? But you're honed in on that answer on each of those items, particularly, right, the technical POV, right, and how you're going to win over that customer in the product.
Yeah, I think what we've seen is, from our perspective, going through this journey ourselves, which is that actually just positioning gets a lot easier. It becomes a lot for us. The clear sign of product market fit was in some ways like when you didn't have to spend all the time explaining yourself why you exist. And so and that sounds like kind of what you're teasing out, which is like, hey, do people understand what you're getting and are they able to buy it?
Exactly.
Awesome. Have you seen, and again, this goes back to something you talked about earlier. And we have a strong point of view around inference here. How have you seen founders balance, building infrastructure internally versus externally? I think this is somewhat changing. From our perspective here is that, again, build was differentiated for you, especially early days, unless there is some strategic advantage for you owning that part of stack, and do that later rather than earlier. While you don't need to focus on margin when you are don't know if you have any value yet. And how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to give a nuanced answer that I think hasn't been repeated time after time, right? But it just goes back to the question of what's different for you. or what's differentiated for you, and how can you focus most of your time on that aspect as opposed to everything else. Like you said, I do think a lot of this is, there's just new ways of doing this in the AI infra world, right? And that comes across in inference. It comes in other layers of the AI infra stack. And actually, yeah, I would turn it over to you, which is, if you think about Baseten, you think about the people who have pushed to build as opposed to buy, right? And I know many times you've been able to kind of show them why you shouldn't do that. What have been the core reasons that they've actually been convinced?
Yeah, I think it comes down to like two or three things. And the first one is there's actually not that much of a cost advantage to doing it yourself, especially not in the early days. And what I mean by that is that using if you think of a company at scale, the incremental cost of using something like Base 10 might be 1 to 2 headcount. But really, when you think about companies running AI infrastructure at scale, they usually need a team of 6 to 10 people to do that. And so like the trade-off there is pretty important. I think the second piece is kind of the model that we take. The model we take is that we get deeply embedded with our customers. And so the customers can really think of us as an extension of their team as opposed to just a vendor. And I think like if you have, our customers as an example have our on-calls number. And if you have that sort of relationship with your vendors, like it starts to feel like, hey, I can give them a big part of this without losing a ton of control, without losing a lot of accountability.
Yeah.
And I think like the third piece is just, you can move faster. It's like, especially while you figure out, if you think about what we think is like the best or the most interesting application layer companies, it's the one where they're kind of abstracted away from the model. And the model empowers the experience, does not the experience itself.
Yep.
And, especially as we're seeing the models get better so rapidly, being able to switch that out very
Exactly.
quickly. And like having someone like a Base 10 who's constantly thinking about what does inference mean in 2025, not just how do I run this model.
Yeah.
I think that it kind of scales with the organization.
Yeah. Yeah, this is something we didn't touch on before, but right, if you think about it, there's so much that's changing at the underlying model and research layer, right? And these are optimizations that one can take advantage of. And it's overall very dynamic. If you are owning that completely yourself, right, you need to be consistently be paying attention to what's happening in open source, what's happening in research, what should I be doing, right? And I think at the end of the day, you're better equipped, you and your team are most likely better equipped to be doing that because that's all you're focused on.
If you could think about some interesting areas that you want to see, AI applications that you're not seeing them yet, what comes to mind?
That's a very good question. There's a lot to be done in ITSM, right?
What's
And
the ICSM stand?
yeah, so if you think about ServiceNow as a very large incumbent, and I think most people think of it as like an underlying ticketing system that, for the most part gets sold to IT, right? And allows you to do all your IT service desk management, workflows. There's actually many more components to what ServiceNow does. And, these large organizations have essentially like dozens of use cases within ServiceNow, and these are highly customized deployments. I think that if you look at the fundamentals of what's happening in there, those are perfect opportunities for AI to be deployed, right? And actually, I would say that those fundamentals are highly mimicked in customer support, right? Where, you're doing some work on top of a ticketing system where you're interfacing with an end customer, whether it be an external customer or an employee, right? And so we've seen those starting to work in existing startups in the support space. You could easily see that happen in IT, right? So that's one example. Right. I mean, we're in early innings of the AI SRE space, but as you know, we're involved in a company called Resolve AI. But there's a lot to be done there. And it's all also, predicated on the advancement of code gen also working well, which luckily, there's been massive improvements in. And so there's just a lot of opportunities, not just in the AI SRE space, but in what other functions can you take advantage of code gen improving? So all these things are kind of, similar to Baseten, right? So the tide rises, and there's a lot of opportunities that can rise with it.
Awesome. Maybe just to finish up here, do you have a hot take for us?
I think my hot take or my hot question, right, is when is the entire market going to catch up to the fact that inference and what Baseten is doing is actually not a commodity, right? And there's pretty But it's pretty strong complexity in differences between each of these inference providers. And I think this has taken form in some of the developable tools you guys have built already and what you're going to build. But the market needs to understand that, right? And I don't think they do yet, but I think that as they start getting these workloads, in production at scale, people are going to realize that there's significant differences between best in class and, right, just bundling it into your cloud platform.